The courtroom fell eerily silent as 5-year-old Sophie Bennett passed through the imposing wooden doors, her small hand clutching the leash of Max, a German shepherd bearing a long, jagged scar along his flank. Every gaze in the room followed the young girl as she approached the witness stand, her steps hesitant yet resolute. Judge James Harrison, a seasoned jurist with decades of legal expertise, leaned forward slightly, observing the child with a careful eye. He knew the entire case rested on her fragile shoulders. Sophie was the sole witness to an attempted kidnapping, a case that, if successful, could imprison a dangerous man for life. But there was a challenge. Sophie hadn't spoken a single word since the incident. Across the room, Thomas Reed sat at the defense table, his demeanor calm, even smug. A 45-year-old software engineer with an unremarkable appearance. Reed had been apprehended after an eyewitness placed him at the scene of Sophie's attempted abduction. Yet his defense was strong: no physical evidence, no confession, and a witness unable to testify. His attorney had crafted a strategy focused on undermining the traumatized child's ability to identify him. But then, something shifted. As Sophie settled into the witness chair, her green eyes locked onto Thomas Reed's. Her tiny fingers trembled, making a subtle gesture, barely noticeable to the untrained observer. It was a silent signal, honed over weeks of therapy. Only two beings in the room caught it: Max and Judge Harrison. Max's response was immediate. The moment Sophie's fingers twitched in that quiet plea for help, the dog's body stiffened, his ears perked forward, his muscles tensing like a coiled spring. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest, a sound of warning, of recognition. His golden brown eyes fixed on Reed, unwavering and piercing. The reaction sent a wave of unease through the courtroom. Murmurs spread among the spectators, whispers of speculation filling the air. Something about the dog's behavior struck a chord. This wasn't just a well-trained support animal reacting to his handler's distress. This was something deeper, something primal. Judge Harrison's gavel struck sharply, the sound echoing like thunder through the chamber. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he declared, his voice carrying an unusual urgency. Prosecutor Rachel Foster shot him a puzzled glance, but he avoided her gaze, instead looking at Sophie, who clung to Max as if he were her lifeline. Something significant had just occurred, and he needed to understand its implications before the trial continued. As the courtroom emptied, Harrison remained seated, his mind racing. In his many years on the bench, he had never seen a therapy dog react with such unmistakable certainty. What had Max recognized? And more crucially, what did it mean for the case? Outside in the corridor, Sophie knelt beside Max, her small hands tightly gripping his fur. Her mother, Claire Bennett, crouched beside her, smoothing back the child's curly hair with trembling hands. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she whispered. Sophie didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her grip on Max tightened, her small frame pressing into his side. Daniel Brooks, the lead investigator, observed from a few steps away. A seasoned FBI agent with decades of experience, Brooks trusted his instincts, which had rarely failed him. Right now, his gut told him that whatever had just transpired in the courtroom was a turning point. He approached Judge Harrison, his voice low. "Something spooked that dog," he murmured. "I'd bet my badge he recognizes Reed from somewhere." Harrison exhaled slowly, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "Then we need to find out where." Meanwhile, in the defense's private room, Thomas Reed sat across from his attorney, Stephen Palmer. The moment they were alone, the smug confidence on Reed's face twisted into something colder. His fingers tapped the table as he replayed the moment in his mind. The girl hadn't spoken, but the dog had reacted. "She knows," he muttered under his breath. Palmer raised an eyebrow. "What?" Reed forced a tight smile. "Nothing," he said, but his thoughts were racing. That damn dog, he hadn't anticipated the animal would pose a problem. Now, he realized Max might be the key to unraveling everything. As the 15-minute recess neared its end, Judge Harrison adjusted his robes and took a deep breath. He didn't believe in coincidences, and something told him that Max had just provided the trial's most critical clue. It was time to dig deeper. For the first time since the case began, he sensed the momentum shifting. Before the silence, before the terror that stole her voice, Sophie Bennett was a vibrant, talkative child. At 5 years old, she was the kind of girl who filled a room with endless stories, her bright blue eyes sparkling with curiosity and mischief. She loved fairy tales, stuffed animals, and the way her mother read bedtime stories, using distinct voices for each character. She had never known fear until that fateful afternoon. It had been a perfect spring day, the kind where the scent of blooming flowers drifted through the air and the warm sun cast golden streaks across the backyard. Claire Bennett had been watching her daughter from the kitchen window, a smile tugging at her lips as Sophie twirled in the yard, her pink dress flaring like a ballerina's. Robert Bennett was due home in a few hours, and Claire had been debating whether to start dinner or wait for him. It should have been an ordinary afternoon. It should have been safe. At 3:42 p.m., Claire's phone rang. It was her sister, calling from out of state. She stepped inside for what she thought would be a brief conversation. For minutes, that was all it took. When she returned to the yard, the gate stood ajar. A wave of icy terror surged through her veins, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the space where her daughter had been. Sophie was still there, but she wasn't alone. A black van idled near the curb, its side door slightly open. A man knelt beside Sophie, his smile unnervingly warm. "I have puppies in my van," he was saying, his voice smooth and practiced. "Special ones. They need a little girl to take care of them. Would you like to see?" Claire's world seemed to slow, her instincts screaming before her mind could process the scene. Her voice cut through the air, "Sophie." The man's head snapped up, his smile vanishing, replaced by something sharp and calculating. In an instant, he grabbed Sophie's arm. Sophie froze. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She only stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes, as if some deep-rooted fear had paralyzed her. Across the street, Dorothy Wilson, a retired nurse strolling with her terrier, witnessed the entire scene unfold. Her voice, seasoned by age yet firm with conviction, rang out, "Hey, leave that child alone." The man hesitated, his hold on Sophie loosening for a fleeting moment. That brief pause was enough. Sophie tugged her arm free and dashed toward her mother. Claire swept her daughter into her arms just as the van's engine roared to life. The tires screeched against the pavement, the vehicle speeding off, leaving dark streaks of rubber on the road. Claire held Sophie tightly, her heart pounding in her chest, but Sophie didn't weep. She didn't speak. She only pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, trembling. The police arrived within minutes. Detective Daniel Brooks, a veteran investigator from the FBI's Child Abduction Task Force, took charge of the scene. His graying hair and piercing brown eyes reflected years spent pursuing elusive criminals, searching for missing children who too often remained lost. He had seen this pattern before, far too many times. He fits the profile, Brooks muttered, flipping through a worn notebook. 4 children have vanished in the last 18 months, all approached near their homes, all enticed with promises of puppies. His partner, Agent Amanda Clark, knelt beside Sophie, her tone soft but resolute. "Sweetheart, can you recall what the man looked like?" Silence. Claire smoothed Sophie's hair, her hands shaking. "Honey, it's okay, you're safe now. Can you tell the officer what he looked like?" Sophie's small hands clung tightly to her mother's sweater, but she didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't shake her head. It was as if a switch had been flipped, silencing her voice completely. "She hasn't said a word since I picked her up," Claire whispered, fear lacing her voice. "She just won't talk." Agent Clark exchanged a glance with Brooks. "Selective mutism," she murmured, "a trauma response." Brooks sighed, rubbing his temple. "Without a statement, we don't have much. The description is vague, a man, a black van. It could be anyone." Dorothy Wilson, who had seen the attempted abduction, stepped forward. "I got part of the license plate," she said firmly. "The first 3 letters, YKZ." Brooks' eyes snapped to her. "That's something." Claire, still holding Sophie, felt a wave of helplessness. Her daughter, once so vibrant, had withdrawn into herself. In the days that followed, Sophie's condition worsened. She stopped playing, stopped drawing, refused to leave the house, and flinched at the sight of passing cars. She barely slept, and when she did, her nights were plagued by silent nightmares, her small body thrashing against unseen threats. Her screams never came, only gasps of terror that woke her parents in the dead of night. Claire and Robert tried everything: story time, favorite foods, her cherished stuffed bunny. Nothing worked. The child they knew was slipping further away. One evening, Claire sat across from Robert at the kitchen table, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "The therapist suggested a support animal," she said softly, "a therapy dog." Robert ran a weary hand through his hair. "Do you really think that'll help?" "I don't know," Claire admitted, "but I'm willing to try anything." Neither could have foreseen how transformative that decision would be. Because while Sophie had lost her voice, there was someone who could still hear her, and his name was Max. The air in Dr. Ellen Ramsey's Animal Rehabilitation Center was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and the earthy aroma of fur. The room was quiet, save for the steady ticking of a clock and the occasional scrape of claws on the tiled floor. On a large orthopedic bed by the window, a German shepherd lay still, his deep brown eyes tracking every movement with quiet intensity. His name was Max. Once, he had been one of the city's finest K9 officers, a dog whose instincts and training had saved lives. Now, he bore the scars of his sacrifice, a jagged mark running along his right flank, a permanent reminder of the night that ended his career. 3 years ago, during a raid to rescue a kidnapped child, Max had lunged at an armed suspect without hesitation. The man had slashed at him with a knife meant for an officer, cutting deep into his flesh. Max subdued the suspect, even as blood stained his fur, but the injury never fully healed. His mobility was compromised, and the department, strapped for funds, made the painful choice to retire him. He had been placed on a euthanasia list, deemed unfit for service. That was until Ellen intervened. Dr. Ramsey had been running the therapy animal program for years, specializing in cases where animals could aid trauma survivors. When she learned of Max's case, she fought to adopt him, convinced his sharp mind and steadfast loyalty still had purpose. Now, she was about to test that conviction. Claire Bennett sat nervously in a chair, her fingers clutching the fabric of her skirt. Sophie stood behind her, peeking out from behind her mother's shoulder. The little girl had refused to speak since the incident 2 weeks earlier, and despite attending therapy, nothing had drawn a word from her. Ellen knelt to Sophie's level, her voice gentle. "Hi, Sophie. I'm Ellen. I work with very special dogs that help kids who've been through frightening things." Sophie said nothing, her green eyes flickering to the large German shepherd a few feet away. Max sat patiently, his ears perked forward, but he didn't approach. He simply watched, his presence calm and unthreatening. "Would you like to meet him?" Ellen asked. Sophie didn't respond, but she didn't flee either. That was a start. Claire smoothed her daughter's hair. "He's a very kind dog, sweetheart. He used to be a police dog, like the ones in your storybooks." Ellen gestured to Max and gave a quiet command, "Stay." The German shepherd didn't so much as flinch. Ellen turned back to Sophie. "You don't have to come close if you don't want to. Max will wait right here. But if you feel ready, you can hold out your hand, and he'll come to you." Sophie hesitated for long moments, frozen in place. Then, inch by inch, she stepped out from behind her mother. Her tiny hand lifted, hesitant but deliberate. Max remained still, waiting for Ellen's final cue. When she nodded, he slowly lowered his head and took a careful step forward, then another and another. The moment his warm breath touched Sophie's palm, something shifted. Sophie's fingers curled slightly, brushing through the dog's thick fur. The connection was made. Claire gasped softly, pressing a hand to her mouth. It was the first time Sophie had reached out to anything or anyone since the attack. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Oh, baby." Sophie's small fingers burrowed deeper into Max's fur, gripping him as if he were the only stable thing in a world that had become terrifyingly uncertain. Ellen smiled. "That's a good girl, Sophie. Max likes you." The child said nothing, but she didn't let go. Over the next few weeks, Max and Sophie became inseparable. At home, she would sit beside him for hours, her tiny hands tracing the scar along his side. When nightmares woke her in the middle of the night, it was Max's steady heartbeat that calmed her. Though she still refused to speak, she began drawing again. Simple crayon pictures of a girl and a dog standing together against shadowy figures. One afternoon, while sitting on the floor of Ellen's office, Sophie watched Max perform a simple trick. Something remarkable happened. "Good boy," she whispered. The words were so faint that for a moment, Claire believed she might have imagined them. But when she turned, she saw Sophie gazing at Max, her lips slightly parted in astonishment, as if she, too, had surprised herself. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Ellen placed a comforting hand on Claire's arm. "She trusts him," she whispered. Sometimes, trust is the first step toward rediscovering her voice. Claire squeezed Ellen's hand. "Then we'll follow wherever that trust takes us." And it would guide them to a place they never anticipated, a courtroom where a predator would finally be exposed. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with suspense. The gallery seats were packed with journalists, families, and legal observers, all watching with bated breath as one of the most prominent trials in recent memory was set to commence. At the center of the room, the defendant, Thomas Reed, sat beside his attorney, his face impassive despite the gravity of the charges against him. He appeared unsettlingly composed, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the polished wood of the defense table. Seated next to her mother, Sophie Bennett gripped Max's leash tightly, her small fingers wrapped around the sturdy fabric as if it were her anchor. The German shepherd sat vigilant beside her, his ears perked forward, his deep brown eyes fixed on Reed. Every so often, his nose twitched, as if detecting a familiar scent in the air. "All rise," the bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber as Judge James Harrison entered, his robe flowing behind him. He took his place at the elevated bench, his keen eyes sweeping the room before resting briefly on Sophie and Max. He had already ruled to allow the therapy dog's presence, though he knew the decision was not without controversy. "Before we proceed with opening statements," Harrison said, his deep voice calm and deliberate, "the court will hear arguments regarding the presence of the support animal in these proceedings." Stephen Palmer, the defense attorney, rose smoothly, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor," he began, his tone courteous yet firm, "while we acknowledge the prosecution's argument for emotional support, the presence of this animal is highly prejudicial. A large German shepherd in the courtroom may evoke an emotional response from the jury that could unfairly bias them against my client. We request that the dog be removed during testimony." Rachel Foster, the lead prosecutor, stood promptly in response. "Your Honor, Sophie Bennett is 5 years old and a trauma survivor. She has been diagnosed with selective mutism due to her experience. Max is not here for show, he is a medically necessary support animal. His presence enables Sophie to participate in these proceedings without undue distress." Judge Harrison leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I have reviewed the documentation provided by the child psychologist and the animal behaviorist. The dog stays." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, some in agreement, others muttering in dissent. Palmer pressed his lips together, displeased but unwilling to press further, and returned to his seat, casting a quick glance at Reed, who remained eerily expressionless. The trial began in earnest. The prosecution painted a chilling portrait of Reed's actions, a pattern of manipulation, deceit, and predatory behavior spanning years. Witnesses were called, including the elderly neighbor, Dorothy Wilson, who recounted the terrifying moment she saw Reed attempting to lure Sophie into his van. Her voice quavered as she described how he had grabbed the child's arm before fleeing when confronted. Sophie sat silently through it all, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden chair. Her fingers occasionally tightened around the leash, but she never let go. Whenever the tension grew overwhelming, she would glance down at Max, who remained perfectly still, his quiet presence anchoring her. Then came the moment for her testimony. A hush fell over the courtroom as Sophie was gently guided to the witness stand. Claire Bennett walked with her, her protective gaze never wavering from her daughter. She helped Sophie into the seat before stepping back, though every muscle in her body seemed taut with the urge to scoop her daughter up and carry her far from this place. Rachel Foster approached cautiously, her demeanor warm and gentle. "Hi, Sophie," she said with a kind smile. "I know this is a bit frightening, but remember, you don't have to say anything you don't want to. You can just nod or shake your head if that feels easier. And if you need a break, you can let us know." Sophie didn't meet her eyes, her gaze remained fixed on the table, her breathing shallow. But then, as if sensing her unease, Max pressed his body lightly against her leg. She reached down, gripping a handful of his fur. Slowly, she nodded. "Good," Rachel said, keeping her tone light. "Sophie, can you tell us who was with you in your yard that day?" Sophie hesitated, her head still lowered. After a long moment, she slowly raised her arm and pointed directly at Thomas Reed. The defendant's expression remained unchanged, but a flicker of something, perhaps a brief, involuntary tightening of his jaw, passed across his face. Palmer stood immediately. "Objection." The child has been shown images of my client multiple times before the trial. This identification is unreliable. Judge Harrison raised a hand. Overruled. The jury will assess the credibility of the witness. Rachel continued. Sophie, did this man say anything to you that day? The child didn't speak. Instead, she made a small gesture with her hand, a subtle signal. It was the same sign she had given before, the one Max understood. The German shepherd reacted instantly. His ears snapped forward, his muscles tensed, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest, not aggressive, but a clear warning. The reaction sent a jolt through the courtroom. Even Judge Harrison leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Palmer stood again, more urgently this time. Your Honor, I object. This is theatrical. But Harrison wasn't listening. He was watching Max. The dog had gone completely still, his entire focus locked on Reed, as if recognizing a scent only he could detect. It was the same instinctive response he had shown when Sophie first saw Reed. A thought struck Harrison. He turned to Rachel. Miss Foster, he said, his voice carefully measured, has this animal had any prior interaction with the defendant? Rachel hesitated. Not to my knowledge, Your Honor. Harrison turned to the defense table. Mr. Reed, have you encountered this dog before? For the first time, Reed showed a trace of real emotion. His fingers, which had been tapping calmly earlier, now clenched into a fist. He remained silent. Then Rachel's eyes widened as a sudden realization hit her. She turned to her co-counsel, whispering urgently. A moment later, a member of the prosecution team hurried out of the courtroom. What is going on? Palmer demanded, his patience wearing thin. Rachel straightened, her expression unreadable. Your Honor, I request a brief recess. There may be new evidence relevant to this case. Judge Harrison studied her for a long moment before nodding. 15-minute recess. As the courtroom cleared, whispers filled the air, speculation spreading like wildfire. Had Max just recognized Thomas Reed? And if so, from where? Something told Judge Harrison that the answer to that question would change everything. The weight of the case pressed heavily on the prosecution team as new developments emerged. Thomas Reed had been officially linked to multiple disappearances, yet without Sophie's full testimony, the trial hung in a precarious balance. What no one anticipated, however, was that the key to unraveling the case would come not from the child but from the German shepherd who never left her side. The morning air was brisk as the prosecution team, led by Rachel Foster, presented their next motion to introduce fresh forensic evidence. Soil samples discovered in Thomas Reed's van had been examined, and the findings pointed to a specific location, a secluded, uninhabited cabin in the northern woods. Detective Daniel Brooks, with decades of experience in similar cases, understood the significance. Your Honor, Foster addressed Judge Harrison, we request a 24-hour recess to pursue a critical lead. We believe this evidence may provide the final piece needed to resolve this case. Stephen Palmer, Reed's defense attorney, immediately objected. Your Honor, this is merely a stalling tactic. My client has already endured extensive questioning, and there is no concrete evidence connecting him to this so-called cabin. Soil samples are circumstantial at best. Judge Harrison's stern gaze silenced Palmer. Motion granted, he ruled. The prosecution has 24 hours. Court adjourned. As soon as the judge's gavel struck, Brooks and his team sprang into action. Max, Sophie's ever-vigilant protector, was brought along for the operation. His reaction to Reed had been unmistakable. Perhaps he could detect something human senses had overlooked. The search team reached the isolated cabin by early afternoon. The place was eerily quiet, the surrounding trees rustling in the wind. A thick layer of dust coated the porch, yet faint footprints leading to the back door suggested recent activity. Max was the first to react. As they neared the cabin, the dog's ears perked, his nose twitching with sharp intensity. His body stiffened, tail raised, muscles taut like a coiled spring. He let out a low growl, pacing restlessly at the threshold. "This place feels off," Brooks murmured. "Max knows something's here." The team proceeded cautiously, weapons drawn. Inside, the cabin was sparse, a table, a cot, empty food cans stacked in a corner. But then Brooks noticed something unusual. The wooden floor near the back wall had an unnatural seam, a slight indentation that seemed out of place. He tapped on it. Hollow. "There's something beneath here," he said. With swift precision, the officers pried the boards loose. What lay beneath sent chills through their spines. A narrow staircase spiraled into a hidden basement. The air grew cold and damp as they descended, the dim light revealing a horrifying sight: children's belongings, old toys, small shoes, a faded pink backpack. In the farthest corner, chained but alive, was a girl. Lily Harrison, an 8-year-old missing for 6 months, her face pale, her clothes tattered. The moment she saw the officers, her eyes filled with tears of recognition and relief. "Help," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Max reacted instantly, straining against his leash, whining as if sensing the suffering this child had endured. Brooks rushed forward, unlocking the chains and scooping Lily into his arms. "You're safe now," he assured her. "We've got you." Lily clung to him, her frail body trembling. The search had finally concluded, but the nightmare was far from over. Back at the courthouse, news of Lily's rescue spread like wildfire. The gallery was packed as Foster prepared for the final blow against Reed. The judge permitted Lily's discovery to be introduced as evidence, along with the soil sample linking the cabin to Reed's vehicle. "Mr. Reed," Foster addressed the defendant, her voice sharp as steel, "how do you explain the presence of an abducted child locked in a basement on a property directly tied to you?" For the first time, Thomas Reed looked rattled. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. Rachel Foster pressed forward, her tone resolute. "Your DNA was found on the chains. Your vehicle's tires matched the tracks outside the cabin. And, most importantly, Lily Harrison is alive, meaning she can testify against you." The weight of those words settled over the courtroom. A single survivor meant a witness who could dismantle his defense single-handedly. Reed's carefully maintained composure began to crumble. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but it was clear he was trapped. And then it happened again. Max, lying at Sophie's feet, suddenly raised his head, his eyes narrowing at Reed. His hackles rose, a deep growl vibrating through his chest. The room fell silent as the German Shepherd took slow, deliberate steps forward, his gaze fixed on the defendant. It was a look of recognition. Reed flinched, everyone saw it. The man who had maintained his arrogance throughout the trial was now visibly sweating, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He turned to his attorney, muttering something frantically. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I want to change my plea." Gasps erupted across the room. Judge Harrison's gaze darkened. "Mr. Reed, are you stating that you wish to plead guilty?" The room held its collective breath. Reed exhaled shakily. "Yes." The trial's abrupt conclusion sent shockwaves through the nation. Thomas Reed was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his conviction sealing the fate of a man who had terrorized families for years. But the true heroes of the case were not just the lawyers or the detectives. It was a 5-year-old girl who had found her courage and a dog who had never abandoned her. In the days following the sentencing, Sophie spoke her first words in weeks. Holding Max's face in her small hands, she whispered, "Thank you." Her parents wept, knowing their daughter was finally finding her way back to them. As Max wagged his tail, nuzzling her gently, it was clear some bonds were unbreakable. No matter how dark the world became, there would always be those willing to stand against the darkness, even if they walked on 4 legs.